When Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians, he was writing to a group of believers that are only 6 months old in the Lord. If you remember Acts 16 and following, on the second missionary journey, he jumps the Aegean Sea from Troas. Remember when he got that Macedonian call? He goes over to Philippi, and then he goes to Thessalonica, maybe 2 Sabbaths, maybe 20 days at the most. And then he goes down to Athens and goes to Corinth. And 6 months after he gets there, he hears word about this tiny little group of Christ-following people who had turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God. Who had turned to God from the idolatry. And if you do any historical background on the city of Thessalonica, guess what? The historic background of Thessalonica was that it was not only a pagan center, but a sexually pagan center. That if you wanted to worship God, you turned into a young man or a young woman in adulthood, you would go down to the temple prostitute, male or female, doesn't matter, and have sex with that individual and go home and tell your mother that you just went to church and you worshipped and became an adult. And that's the context in which Paul is writing 1 Thessalonians. And he says, you turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God. And so then in chapter 2 and 3, he defends himself. In chapter 4, he begins to talk to them as a father, as a shepherd. And guess what? The very first thing he deals with. It's not love. That's chapter 4, verses 9 and 10. It's not leadership. That's later on. It's not even prayer and worship. That's also later on. Not even the end times. Again, later in chapter 4 and chapter 5, verse 1 and following. The very first issue he deals with is their sexual purity. And he says, for this is the will of God. And I love it because he doesn't say this might be the will of God or this should be the will of God. What does he say? It is. Now, I love teaching New Testament Greek, and I often say to my students, it's not the big words in the Bible that bother me, it's the little ones. What does the word is mean in the original Greek language? It means it is. It's God's determinate will that you and I walk in purity. It's God's will. And I have more evidence that it's God's will that I be pure than it's God's will that I even be at this year's forum. Even more evidence than it's God's will that I be married. I have evidence scripturally, right there clearly stated, it is the will of God. Your sanctification, your set-apartness, your consecration, what? That is that you abstain from sexual immorality. You stop it. You stop it now. It's God's will. And every day of my life I can get up and say, I know it's God's will. I don't have to ask. I don't have to wonder. It's clearly stated in Scripture. It's God's will that I be pure.